I'm Claire Julsing-Strydom. I'm a registered dietitian, and I'm going to be speaking to you about dairy and inflammation, because often there's so much confusion in this space. And if you just open social media, the amount of information that you get bombarded with can be so overwhelming, even for health professionals. And imagine how the public feel when they get these messages. So we're going to go through: where does dairy fit in? What is inflammation? How does it actually work? What's the difference between acute and chronic inflammation? And then we're going to look at the dairy matrix and different types of dairy, and how literature actually clumps a lot of different dairy products together. And should they really be clumped together? We're going to look at that. And we're also going to look at what are the key fundamental properties in dairy that actually give it beneficial impacts on inflammation. I'm going to take you through all of that, and hopefully this will really help you understand how inflammation works and the impact that dairy does have. Okay, so dairy and inflammation. The first thing we need to really understand is, what is inflammation? Okay, what is inflammation? Inflammation is the process, it's the biological process where the body actually activates the immune response to protect us against environmental stimuli. Now, that can be a pathogen, that can be eating something that's not good for us, a food that's unhealthy, something that's really like a mass amount of total energy, or a massive refined carbohydrate meal that spikes glucose. I'll go into more detail about how do we trigger that inflammatory response. So basically, inflammation is when there's an immune response. So it's like half your little immune soldiers are sent off to deal with that inflammation or that inflammatory response. So why do we call it inflammation? How does this actually all work? Let's think of an example where you go to the beach and you go lie on the beach and you don't put any sunscreen on at all. You're going to get sunburned. You're going to lie there, you're going to get frazzled, your whole body is going to be burnt, okay? That you would say to me, Claire, that would be sore, it's going to be red, it's going to be inflamed. That would be a damage, it's an oxidative stress. And your body will have an inflammatory response to that to trigger an immune response to come and fix that damage that was caused. So we get this kind of damage from UV light. We get this damage from smoking. We all know smoking is not good for us. It causes free radicals. It damages cells. We know that that's not good, right? But we also look at how our mitochondria react when we eat certain foods, how that has an impact on inflammation. If we take it one step further, we find a lot of these kind of terminologies in the literature, and it's important that we dive into this a little deeper before we look at how this pertains to dairy. So when we look at oxidative stress and inflammation, when there is damage, inflammatory cytokines get released, and some of them you may be familiar with, and others you might go, I've never heard of those. So we talk about inflammatory cytokines. Fibrinogen is an inflammatory cytokine. These are the names that you'll come across in literature. Ferritin is an inflammatory cytokine. So if you do an iron profile on a patient and the iron profile is all low, they've got low iron, low saturation, low transferrin, but the ferritin's really, really high, and other markers like C-reactive protein, which is also a marker of inflammation, high, it's actually a marker that there's inflammation going on in that body, because the inflammatory response is there. We also look at things like adhesion molecules. These are also types of inflammatory cytokines. Others that you might be familiar with, or you've maybe heard or read about, are interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha. We're going to come across these, but just remember, they're like the little signals going, hello, there's a problem, we need to send help here, there's an inflammatory issue. It's almost like the little sirens that are calling the immune response to come and sort out the problem, whether that is because you got sunburnt, or you took up smoking, or you're getting exposed to pollution every day. Why inflammation is so important, and why we know that this is one of the big underlying sort of factors that underpins a lot of chronic disease, is we get damage to cells in the body. The beta cells in the pancreas get damaged through inflammation. Endothelial cells in the linings of your arteries get damaged by inflammation, and that then regulates your blood pressure, for example. When we have these inflammatory cytokines around the body all the time, it increases risks associated with chronic diseases. So what's the difference between acute inflammation and chronic inflammation? Okay, they're different. They get triggered by different things. So if we look at acute inflammation, we talk about the PAMPs or the PAMPs, and these are the pathogen-associated molecular patterns. So this, for example, is where there's a pathogen, there's an infection. It's going to cause an acute inflammation. The other one is damage-associated molecular patterns, so DAMP. So this is from cellular stress or trauma. You fell when you were running, you hurt your knee like the lady in this picture. That is acute inflammation, where chronic inflammation is exposure to environmental stimuli throughout a lifetime. It's metabolic dysfunction, it's tissue damage, and it's tissue damage like I described in the previous slide, where beta cells get impacted, endothelial cells get impacted. We also know that the duration of acute inflammation it's short-lived, it's quick. You get a cut knee, it heals, it's better, it's gone. Chronic inflammation is a long-term, persisting, non-resolving inflammation. It's there all the time. Okay? It's not short. The magnitude, when we have acute inflammation, it's high-grade inflammation. It's quick, it's red, there's blood, there's swelling, there's lots of like action telling the cells, go and fix it, go and get that sorted out. Where your low-grade chronic inflammation is there all the time. I'm going to explain this as a very nice analogy in a minute. The outcomes, when there's acute inflammation, your body can heal, the trigger comes, it removes the damage, so the tissue is repaired. When there's long-term chronic inflammation, we're getting collateral damage. It's just there, it's ongoing, it's relentless, it never stops. It's low grade, but it's sizzling along in the background, causing lots of damage. And then, is it age-related? With acute inflammation, no, because if you fall or you get a bug, you can be a baby and you can be 100 years old. It's not age-related. Chronic inflammation is age-related. The older you get, the worse inflammation gets. And you've got chronic inflammation, and you adding on kilograms, and you're adding on chronic diseases, and you're adding on lifestyle choices that aren't good on top of age, that impacts that low-grade chronic inflammation and what that looks like. And then the biomarkers in acute inflammation, things like interleukin-6, human necrosis factor alpha, interleukin 1B, your CRP, C-reactive protein, these all go up. Okay, those are the big words I mentioned earlier. Those, remember, they're the classification of these inflammatory cytokines or biomarkers. With chronic inflammation, there's no significant key markers that you can go and look at. The one that we sort of can use is the highly sensitive C-reactive protein. That's a blood test that we can measure, and we actually want that under 1. So when somebody's really battling with chronic inflammation, that starts rising, and we see elevations in chronic inflammation. Okay, so here are some systemic chronic inflammation factors that impact this ongoing inflammatory picture. If the patient or the person we're dealing with is obese, they're inactive, there's dysbiosis and the gut function's not working properly, and then they've got pathogens in their bowel, they don't have good microbiota, short-chain fatty acid production, their diet's not good, they're isolated. I mean, think of COVID and what COVID meant. If there's isolation or chronic stress, not getting enough sleep, these are all factors that play a role in exacerbating chronic inflammation. This then leads to chronic diseases, which are the purple pictures on the right-hand side of the screen. So this picture is one of my favorites because we're also familiar with this picture of a felt fire burning. We see this in the winter time. And what we know is that when this felt fire is going along, it will just casually carry on and burn an entire felt and make it completely black and burnt. And this is how I like to explain chronic inflammation to my patients, because chronic inflammation is like a felt fire. It's always hanging around there. It's always in the background. You are either putting it out with a fire hydrant and you're reducing that chronic inflammation, or your lifestyle, your sleep, your stress, your diet, your physical activity, etc., like the slide I just showed you, is exacerbated. And that's like standing on the side of this felt fire with a box of fire lighters and literally going, look, look, throwing fire lighters into that felt fire and getting explosions. You're exacerbating the chronic inflammation. Okay, so if we look at dietary inflammatory index, this shows us if a food is pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. Okay? So something like saturated fats or trans fats or very energy-dense foods can be pro-inflammatory. Anti-inflammatory foods are things like turmeric, flavonoids, onions, monounsaturated fats. But where does dairy fit into all of this? Okay, so where does it fit into this inflammatory picture? The first thing we need to understand is the overarching term of dairy in the literature is very overarching. It's including things like milk and yogurt and mass and cheese and cottage cheese and ice cream, cream, butter. That's a lot of things to put into one group, but often in the literature we have got this picture of all these things being classified together. We need to also understand that, like fresh fruits and vegetables, milk is a whole food, okay? Whole foods contain many natural occurring nutrients that work together in a complex food structure to support digestion, absorption, and metabolism. This is called the food matrix. And the food matrix in particular in dairy is also referred to as the dairy matrix, because you could take these supplement or these components in a supplement, but you're not getting that same picture, that same food matrix, that same bioavailability that you would get from actually eating the whole food in all its parts, all those puzzle pieces in the picture connected together, the calcium, potassium, protein, etc. You can see them all on the screen. Research has shown that the unique interaction of nutrients and other bioactive components in dairy contributes to health and wellness, and helps with heart disease to reduce it, improves gut function, and reduces the risks of certain chronic diseases. And we've seen a lot in the literature about moving away from individual nutrients and rather focusing health and nutrition messages on the food matrix and food in its whole form with all its different components grouped together, because we get different impact when foods are consumed in their entirety. So here's a little trick question. Is ice cream even dairy? Maybe my question was already a bit leading, but the answer is that most of it in South Africa, so 80 to 90% of ice creams are not dairy. They are mostly made up of vegetable oils. I'm going to just repeat that. They are mostly made of vegetable oil, and unless they contain cream or milk, would not be considered as a dairy product. So I actually pulled up an example to show you these two ice creams. They're both called ice cream. They're from the same company, basically, but you can see the vanilla ice cream on the left. The first few ingredients, the first top 3 ingredients is water, sugar, and vegetable fat. It's a palm kernel oil, okay? It's not dairy. So this is not going to be considered actually dairy, yet often foods get classified into the dairy classification, even in literature sometimes, where they're looking at this but not actually the right type of food matrix. And this is why it's so important that dietitians speak about these kinds of things and educate the public on this. If you look at the ice cream on the right-hand side, it actually says dairy ice cream. So here you can see the first ingredient is whole milk or skim milk, as opposed, and then both have sugar. This one also has butter, which is also dairy. So the main ingredients here are vastly different, and we can't compare the two. The effects of fermented dairy. Now, when we start looking at the literature, there was a review that looked at postprandial response in healthy adults that consumed yogurt versus acidified milk. They found no significant difference in inflammatory biomarkers, including high sensitive CRP, chemokines, as well as the tumor necrosis factor alpha, as well as interleukin 6 and the lipopolysaccharide. So no difference in the yogurt or the acidified milk. And we can see that the intake of yogurt and acidified milk actually reduced the inflammation and down-regulated inflammatory genes. And this happened 4 hours ingestion of the yogurt and 2 hours after consuming the milk. Okay, so in this case, the fermented dairy was down-regulated the inflammation. The effects of dairy lipids on inflammation also play a role. So people say, well, what about the high content of saturated fats in dairy? Does it increase inflammation? Is the question. So Labonte et al. In 2014 looked at a randomized controlled trial with 112 people with chronic low-grade inflammation. And they looked at dairy consumption. There was no significant adverse effects on inflammatory markers, even in overweight or obese patients, despite the high saturated fat in the dairy. A meta-analysis also showed that no significant relationship between dairy consumption and the risk for cardiovascular disease. Milk intake might even be associated with an overall reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. This is a 2019 meta-analysis that was published. Now, this paper here was published in 2020, and they took it was a randomized controlled trial crossover where they had 47 healthy subjects, and they were given 4 different meals. Okay, they were either given whipped cream or butter or cheese or sour cream. Okay, so all dairies, but obviously they're different food matrices here that we're dealing with. So what did they find? All the meals induced a postprandial inflammatory response, but did not increase the postprandial CRP or the C-reactive protein. The mechanism may involve an inflammatory response through the liposaccharide toll-like receptor 4 binding, which likely activates the nuclear factor kappa beta and the expression of inflammatory-related genes, or alters the gut microbiota to overproduce liposaccharide, hence worsening the inflammatory response of the high-fat meal. So this is that immediate postprandial lipidemia that we sometimes read about. But what happened when they compared? So they then looked at, okay, how did the fermented products compare to the whipped cream and the butter? The fermented products, the sour cream and the cheese, had less pro-inflammatory responses, even though they contained the same amount of fat. So they looked at this, they said, okay, these products all have the same amount of fat, but how is this affecting inflammation, even with the fact, based on the fact that these are dairy products? Okay, so the response of the cheese differed the most out of the foods that were non-fermented products. And the thinking was that the cheese had much higher protein than the butter, the cream, or the sour cream. So its the concentration of plasma and the amino acids increased after the intake of cheese compared to the other meals. There's also calcium in cheese, and they found that when there is more calcium, the calcium suppresses the inflammatory response. And there was 7 times more calcium in the cheese than in the sour cream. And this is responsible for inducing an increase in anti-inflammatory peripheral blood mononuclear cells. And this helps to reduce that inflammatory gene expression response. So it was very interesting that the cheese actually seemed to be better than the others just because of the calcium and the protein that's different from the other example that were also still high in fat. Here's another study. This is a very new one, a 2020 paper by Musavian. I think that's the way we say it. And what they did here is they looked at this, it was a systematic review and meta-analysis. It included 663 adult participants, and they compared individuals with low or no dairy intake to adults that have high consumption of dairy. And what they found is the people that had a higher consumption of dairy had decreases in CRP, they had decreases in the TNF-alpha, the interleukin-6 was decreased, and the MCP concentration were improved, as well as increased adiponectin levels were increased. So that was helpful and beneficial. They did a subgroup analysis where they said, okay, the dairy consumption appeared to have no effect on inflammatory biomarkers, and authors therefore concluded that even though dairy products had higher saturated fatty acids, they do not promote inflammation, as no studies reported an increase in circulating inflammatory markers. So, I mean, this is great news for us when people are getting confused about this dairy message. So we can actually give them really good systematic reviews, meta-analysis that are newly published. So I would highly recommend screenshotting this page and getting this article. It's a very good paper to read. Lastly, the amino acid, the lysine in dairy. The high concentration of amino acid lysine in dairy contributes to its anti-inflammatory properties. So the lysine actually increases the anti-inflammatory adiponectin expression and decreases the pro-inflammatory cytokine expression. And this reduces oxidative and inflammatory stress by stimulating the mitochondrial biogenesis. It increases the oxygen consumption and the fatty acid oxidation in the adipocytes, the little fat cells and the muscle cells. And it also induces protein synthesis and suppression of protein degradation. So you can see the full list of the benefits of the amino acid and the lysine in the proteins basically in the dairy and the benefit that they also have. In conclusion, overall, the scientific evidence of the effects of milk on inflammation and biomarkers demonstrate that the consumption of milk does not appear to have pro-inflammatory effects in healthy individuals or patients or individuals with metabolic abnormalities such as type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, obesity, etc. We do need more evidence to identify specific dairy foods as having anti-inflammatory potential. However, fermented products may modulate this inflammation and immune response via various different mechanisms. There will be a literature review being published soon on this that you can review from, sorry, I'm going to just repeat that. More evidence is needed to identify specific dairy foods as having anti-inflammatory potential. Fermented dairy products may modulate the inflammation and immune response via various mechanisms. And there's a large body of evidence that shows that in addition to dairy containing a large number of nutrients important for growth and development, it does not appear to contribute to chronic inflammation, and that dairy that is fermented might in fact have anti-inflammatory properties. Thank you very much. I hope you have learned some more information about inflammation in dairy and will be able to navigate discussions and patient queries and speaking to the lay public on social media platforms with greater ease after having this information at your disposal.